everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest, a side-scrolling platforming title developed by Rare and published by Nintendo, and released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1995. We are going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 95. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards. Everything is out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly encourage you to play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broad game-playing population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest is a side-scrolling platforming title developed by Rare and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1995. Before we can talk about Donkey Kong Country 2, we've got to take a step back and talk about the creation of its predecessor, Donkey Kong Country 1, and by extension, the formation of its creator, UK software development studio, Rare. Longtime listeners may recall that we actually had an episode focused exclusively on Donkey Kong Country 1, all the way back in episode 10. My intent is not to rehash all of that history here, but instead to provide a little bit of a summary so that we're all starting from the same playing field as we begin discussing the second Donkey Kong Country adventure. So let's talk about Donkey Kong Country. As many likely know, Donkey Kong Country was the creation of development studio Rare, an incredibly talented and successful company that was originally founded in 1985 by brothers Tim and Chris Stamper, mostly as a way to insulate them and their work from the corporate machinations of video game publisher Ocean, who in the mid-80s was in the process of attempting to acquire the Stampers' first company, Ultimate Play the Game. Ultimate Play the Game was originally founded by the Stampers in 1982 as a means of entering the video game market, and in particular, was created so the duo could focus on developing video games for the UK-centric ZX Spectrum computer, an 8-bit computer platform developed by Sinclair Research in 1982. Shortly after its release, the ZX Spectrum would become very popular across the UK, eventually becoming Britain's best-selling microcomputer of all time, and the Stampers were intrigued by the possibility of developing software for such a potentially lucrative market. So, they decided to begin creating games for the platform, though the Stampers' approach to video game development was a bit different than most development studios of the time. We have talked about this before, but in the early days of the home video and computer game market, many of the games that smaller companies worked on were simply ports or clones of existing popular arcade titles, like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Pong, just to name a few. The Stampers, however, did not want to simply recreate experiences other people had made. They wanted to strike out on their own to develop new and unique games, or at a minimum, they wanted to improve upon titles that others had made previously, with the goal of putting their own spin on whatever game style or genre they may decide to work on. This drive to create new and unique experiences is what prompted the Stampers and their company to create the game Night Lore in 1984, a very early three-dimensional isometric perspective action-adventure title, complete with a large explorable world, interactive objects, traps, climbable structures, and a variety of items to collect. Night Lore was not the first isometric 3D game, but it was widely considered to be one of the best at the time of its release, and even beyond its isometric roots, in later years, the game would go on to be named one of the most important British video game releases in history. Many gamers and historians have suggested that Night Lore represented a significant shift and evolution beyond the games that had come before it, and proved conclusively that Ultimate Play the Game was a talented development studio that gamers everywhere, or at least in the UK, should pay attention to. After Night Lore's success, Ultimate Play the Game would continue to release titles for the ZX Spectrum into the mid-80s, but as time went on, the Stampers recognized that their audience was being unnecessarily limited by their singular focus on the ZX Spectrum computer platform. Sure, the ZX Spectrum was popular in the UK, but outside of that market, it really didn't have any degree of popularity or sales, which meant that Ultimate Play the Game didn't have much recognition outside of its UK base of operations. The Stampers wanted to continue to grow their company, but they realized that focusing on the UK ZX Spectrum market was not the best way to set themselves up for future success. And even beyond that limited market, in the mid-80s, video game publisher Ocean was entering into talks to buy out the Stampers company, which would have effectively made it more difficult for the Stampers to continue delivering quality titles the way they had been for the past several years. So, the Stampers set up a separate pseudo-shell company, Rare Limited, that would be insulated from any potential Ocean buyout of Ultimate Play the Game. The thought being that the real development work and team could be centralized under Rare, insulating that core team from the ramifications of any potential buyout, and by extension, remaining an independent development studio. With the goal of distancing themselves from any corporate political shenanigans that could impact their actual work on games, the Stampers sold their stake in Ultimate Play the Game, split from the company, and formally stood up Rare Limited as a standalone development studio in 1985. As Rare, the Stampers and their team would end up delivering a ton of incredibly important and impressive releases over the years, exclusively for Nintendo's console platforms, as Rare would become one of Nintendo's most trusted third-party development partners. The beginning of that relationship, though, has an interesting history itself. As the Stampers began brainstorming how to expand their market reach following their split from Ultimate Play the Game, they began to consider what platform or platforms they might want to focus their efforts on. And here, a relatively new console from Japan, the Nintendo Famicom, made the duo and their company take notice. Here was a console that was taking the gaming world by storm, a cartridge-driven piece of technology with no load times, advanced for the time graphics and sound, and a rapidly expanding install base amongst consumers. The Stampers realized that this might be their ticket to bigger and better things, so they decided to import a Famicom console in the hopes of figuring out how to develop software for the system. Now, a quick word about developing software for the Nintendo Famicom. As longtime listeners may recall, Nintendo's Famicom was designed to be a closed ecosystem, where aspiring game designers couldn't simply create titles for the system without any degree of Nintendo engagement. Nintendo instead required anyone creating software for their system to acquire a license from the company, and with that license would come the technical information necessary to actually program games for the console, the goal being the reduction of low-effort throwaway games being released for the system. To help prevent unauthorized development, Nintendo had made it so that the Famicom was, in their words, impossible to reverse engineer. Meaning, if anyone wanted to create a game for it, they needed the equivalent of Nintendo's secret decoder ring. This was in stark contrast to other consoles of the time, like the Atari 2600, whose ecosystem was entirely open for anyone to develop for. And it was that open ecosystem that drove, at least in part, the glut of shovelware that eventually crippled the United States video game industry in 1983. If someone wanted to create a game for Atari system, all they needed was some time and some programming technical know-how, and they could release a game. Atari didn't care, and they didn't enforce any sort of quality control for the system. Their thought was, the more games, the better. A belief that would be disproven fairly quickly as consumer confidence in home video games faltered, causing a wholesale video game market crash in 1983. Nintendo's much more controlling licensing and oversight policy was an attempt at avoiding a similar fate as Atari, and with their own console technology obscured from potential unauthorized developers, the company believed they had things pretty much under control. Rare, however, was not like other development studios, and they took the whole concept of the Famicom being impossible to reverse engineer as a personal challenge. Rare would end up importing the console, and in relatively short order, was able to create a series of demo games for the Famicom, despite the fact that they had no direct involvement from Nintendo at all. They had effectively hacked the console, something that Nintendo believed could not be done, and they had actual running game demos to prove it. Rather than using this unauthorized development effort as a way to circumvent Nintendo's policies and potentially open themselves up to legal action, Rare instead sent the demos to Nintendo as a means of proving their overall technical prowess. A bold move, and one that Rare hoped would endear themselves to the console giant, as opposed to resulting in a cease and desist notice, which even back then, Nintendo was apt to do. Well, it turns out that Nintendo was so impressed that someone was able to crack their technology copy protections that they offered Rare a partnership contract on the spot, and extended Rare an offer where they would provide unlimited budget to the company for future titles, provided all of their work was exclusive to Nintendo platforms. The prospect of an unlimited budget and free reign to create whatever games they wanted for a console platform with a huge number of potential gamers sounded like a dream come true. So Rare and the Stampers agreed to become development partners with Nintendo, and in the process began a relationship that would persist for nearly 20 years, and would result in a number of beloved games and franchises being created and released by Rare for Nintendo's consoles. While Rare's game catalog would continue to grow more impressive over time, perhaps their most significant opportunity came in 1994, which is when Nintendo began facing increased competition in the home console space, spurred on by continued and relentless pressure by longtime rival Sega, and emerging competitive pressures by console industry newcomer Sony. Both Sega and Sony were readying their next generation of home console releases, systems with significantly more power and more advanced capabilities than the major 16-bit consoles of the time, primarily the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Nintendo, for its part, was not taking this competition lying down, as they themselves were also readying their own next-generation console release, which was intended to be based on a brand new 64-bit console architecture that promised to deliver graphics and gameplay experiences that would blow gamers away. There was just one issue. That brand new console's launch had been delayed, which meant that the Super Nintendo and its now aging 16-bit capabilities had to stand toe-to-toe against the next generation of consoles and games, and hopefully keep Nintendo relevant in the eyes of gamers until their new 64-bit console would be ready to release. To say Nintendo was in a bit of a bind would be an understatement, and the company was in desperate need of a killer title that would keep players and consumers interested in their console, despite the more technologically advanced systems being offered by their competitors. Luckily for Nintendo, they had an ace up their sleeves, which you may have guessed was UK development studio Rare. Like we talked about, Rare, even from its early years, was always focused on creating games and experiences that had never been seen before, and in recent years, they had been experimenting with using high-powered Silicon graphics workstations to create highly detailed and advanced pre-rendered three-dimensional graphics that the company believed could potentially form the foundation of future titles. There was just one issue. Three-dimensional technology in home consoles, especially during the 16-bit era of systems, was not really a thing, and outside of add-on chip enhanced titles like Star Fox, the 3D capabilities for the Super Nintendo were virtually non-existent. But Rare was anything if not creative, so they developed a process by which they could take pre-rendered high-quality graphics generated from Silicon graphics workstations and convert them into the kind of lower-resolution two-dimensional sprite-based artwork that systems like the Super Nintendo could display and process effectively. In this way, the Super Nintendo could display graphics that appeared to be far too advanced for the console, when in reality, the foundation of those graphics was the equivalent of a clever behind-the-scenes graphical trick. That trick, however, was incredibly impressive, and after Rare developed their conversion process for turning pre-rendered 3D images into sprite-based graphics, they demonstrated a prototype game to Nintendo in the hopes of being able to use the technology in a future Nintendo title. Well, to say Nintendo was impressed with the technology would be an understatement, and they believed that this might be a way for their Super Nintendo console to remain relevant while the company continued working on their forthcoming 64-bit system. As a result, Nintendo decided to grant Rare the license to make a brand new platforming title using one of their prized and cherished mascots, which is what led to the eventual creation of the absolutely stellar platforming title Donkey Kong Country. Using their newly developed technique of rendering high-quality graphics and converting them to two-dimensional sprites, Rare set out to once again create a game the likes of which had never been released to the market, with some of the highest quality visuals that had ever been seen on a home console, independent of the number of bits or underlying processing power that a console may have had at its disposal. Rare assembled a dream team of game designers, developers, artists, and musicians to bring Donkey Kong Country to life, including character designer Kevin Bayliss, who would be responsible for the cartoonish designs for most of Donkey Kong Country's characters, game designer Greg Mayles, who would create the majority of the game's overall framework, structure, and levels, and musician David Wise, who would compose most of the game's music and ambient sound effects, just to name a few of the major players responsible for the game. Eventually, Rare would complete work on the title, and Donkey Kong Country would release just in time for the 1994 holiday season, following an extensive $16 million marketing campaign that saw numerous magazine ads, commercials, and other promotional items distributed to prospective players, with a focus on showing that Donkey Kong Country was a true next-generation gaming experience on a decidedly current generation video game platform. And, despite its 16-bit limitations, Donkey Kong Country would release to stellar reviews and universal acclaim, as players around the world had their minds collectively blown by the sheer awesomeness of the game's gameplay, graphics, and sound. Donkey Kong Country would go on to sell so many copies over the course of the 1994 holiday season that its total sales would exceed both the top-grossing film and musical album of the year, nearly combined. In total, Donkey Kong Country would gross over $400 million by the end of the 1994 holiday season, an almost unfathomable number for the time, and one that proved, once again, that Rare was a development studio almost without equal. Interestingly, even before Donkey Kong Country was released, the team had begun to conceptualize what a potential Donkey Kong Country 2 would look like. As is often the case when development studios work on a video game, there are different concepts, characters, motifs, and other features that might be proposed throughout a product's development, but might eventually be cut from the final product, either because of quality concerns or timing, or simply because the ideas never got fully fleshed out enough to be included in the game. And here, Donkey Kong Country would be no different, as even though the game itself was designed as a fairly expansive platforming title, Rare couldn't possibly fit all of their ideas into a single game, assuming they actually wanted to release the game on time, that is. So, the team began capturing ideas that they thought had merit but would otherwise not work within the context of Donkey Kong Country, in the hopes that one day they'd be able to revisit the game and develop a full-fledged sequel. They were certainly hoping they'd get that opportunity, but first, they needed to see how the market would respond to their first Donkey Kong Country adventure. Well, $400 million later, the answer was abundantly clear. Donkey Kong Country was a hit, and it would have been downright silly to not greenlight a sequel, which is why, shortly after release, Rare began working on a brand new Donkey Kong adventure, the title that would eventually become known as Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest. As we've been talking about, Rare is not the kind of company that simply iterates on prior work. They never assume that consumers will buy a game that's effectively more of the same as what came before it. So, with Donkey Kong Country 2, the team decided early on that they needed to take a different approach to the various challenges, gameplay elements, and even characters that would make up the majority of the experience, utilizing ideas that weren't able to be fully implemented in time for Donkey Kong Country, while at the same time brainstorming new features that they could potentially include in the sequel. While the core concept of creating a high-quality platforming title remained the goal for the team, who for the most part was comprised of the same talent as the first title staff, the actual content and the way that content would be designed would end up being a fair bit different than the first Donkey Kong Country adventure. To start, and in perhaps the boldest move the team could have taken, Rare decided to create Donkey Kong Country 2 as a title that didn't actually feature Donkey Kong. Instead, sidekick character Diddy Kong would return from the first game, becoming the main character this go-around, and alongside him would be a brand new character, Dixie Kong. Now, a quick word about Donkey and Diddy Kong from the first Donkey Kong Country game. Anyone who's played the title likely recognizes that, despite the inherent size and speed differences between Donkey and Diddy Kong, both characters control roughly the same way, with neither one having any sort of distinguishing moveset to really set them apart from one another. Greg Mayles, the game's designer, and the rest of the Rare team recognized this was a potential miss with the original game. So for its sequel, they decided to utilize characters that would, in fact, be more distinct from one another. The inclusion of Diddy Kong was an obvious one after the team decided to relegate Donkey Kong to kidnappee status, while the creation of Dixie Kong was credited, at least in part, to the decision to remove Donkey Kong's fiancée, Candy Kong, from the title, as Nintendo believed she was a bit too sexually provocative for a family-friendly title. Whether you or I personally agree with that assertion, Rare did acquiesce, and in the process, series newcomer Dixie Kong was created. Interestingly, Dixie Kong's now iconic ponytail helicopter hover ability was not originally intended to be included in the game, and in fact, the only reason a ponytail was even created for the character in the first place was to make her more visually distinct from Diddy Kong, since they both had similar core character models, and to create a more appealing visual effect when she would run around any given level, with her hair flapping in the wind. Greg Mayles considered that there might be something more mechanically significant they could do with the ponytail, which is what prompted the team to add Dixie's helicopter hover ability, with character designer Steve Mayles ending up animating that move, as well as the rest of Dixie's overall moveset. This proved to be a significant addition to the game, as it represented the first true distinction between the two characters, a goal that Mayles and the rest of the team had always had in mind when they sat down to begin making the title. This would expand over time to encompass more differences between the two characters, serving to make each Kong feel different to play, and in the process, creating a more diverse experience for players to enjoy. Level design is another area that the team decided to mix things up for Donkey Kong Country 2, as in the first game, there was a general goal to make each level feel fairly linear, as opposed to giving players a ton of alternate paths to explore and secrets to find. The thought amongst the team was they wanted to create a solid core platforming experience, and to do that, they wanted to distill the act of platforming down to its most foundational elements, those being progressing through a level, navigating around and through obstacles, and defeating or avoiding enemies. From my perspective, the first title definitely delivered on those foundational elements, and like many players, I felt like Donkey Kong Country really succeeded in creating a tight, straightforward, and fun platforming experience. For its sequel, Rare decided to up the ante by not only maintaining the same sense of speed and timing that were prevalent throughout each of the original game's levels, but also including a number of secrets and other opportunities for exploration that in the prior title simply did not exist. This included the introduction of new collectibles to gather, secret areas to explore, mini-games to complete, and even an entirely self-contained, super difficult hidden world to uncover, which players would need to find and beat in order to reach the true ending to the game. This expansion of the core gameplay formula is something that the team at Rare was hoping would deliver a familiar, yet decidedly deeper experience to gamers, who with any luck would appreciate the additional content and hidden features that the team added to the overall game. One area of the experience that did not evolve nearly as much, though, were the game's graphics, which still utilized the revolutionary, for the time, Rare technique of pre-rendering high-quality 3D visuals and converting them into lower-resolution 2D sprites for use on the Super Nintendo console. While the general process for creating the game's graphics didn't differ dramatically between the first and second titles, Rare did take the opportunity to include even more visually impressive environmental effects, and also improved the overall graphics quality, owing to their now better understanding of how best to convert higher quality imagery down to a more manageable format for the Super NES. There's not a dramatic difference between the two titles from a purely visual perspective, but there is definitely some refinement here, which we'll talk about more in our Suda review section coming up in a little bit. Composing the game's music would once again fall to David Wise, who would be tasked with creating a set of diverse audio tracks across a variety of styles, similar conceptually to his work on the first game, which had previously earned him rave reviews while surprising countless gamers with a level of quality that many didn't even realize was possible on the Super Nintendo's sound chip. For Donkey Kong Country 2, Wise set out to once again create music magic, composing tracks that were inspired by the synthesizer-based movie soundtracks of the 80s, Koji Kondo's extensive work on various Nintendo titles, and standard musical genres like big band, disco, and hip-hop, combined with pirate shanty-like tunes and, similar to the first game, what can best be described as thumping jungle beats. The variety of music that Wise composed for the title was vast, and even more so than the first title, his compositions would truly end up pushing the Super NES sound chip to its limits. Eventually, all of the different elements of the game would come together, and Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest would release to gamers around the world on November 21st, 1995, almost 1 year exactly after the release of the original Donkey Kong Country. All of the elements were in place for the sequel to be a hit. It had the same talented team, it expanded on the original in meaningful ways, and because of how well received the original game was, player anticipation was high. The only question was, could Rare strike gold twice in a row? The answer to that question, as anyone who knows anything about the Rare of the 80s and 90s can tell you, is yes, they could. And in fact, critics and gamers almost universally declared Donkey Kong Country 2 to be even better than the original game, with deeper gameplay, more expansive levels with tons of secrets, the same great, though somewhat improved, graphics, and a soundtrack that once again would be heralded as one of the finest 16-bit musical compositions ever created. It would go on to win a number of Game of the Year awards while also selling incredibly well, with most stores being unable to keep the game in stock due to the insane demand for the title. It would end up selling almost 4.5 million copies over its lifetime, earning it recognition as the 6th highest selling Super Nintendo title of all time, and would in later years be recognized by many as one of the best games ever created. Beyond its original release window, Donkey Kong Country 2 would end up being re-released a number of times, both on the Wii U and 3DS Virtual Consoles, the Nintendo Switch Online service, and in 2006, would also get a full-fledged retail re-release on the Game Boy Advance portable console. That version of the title would also end up being incredibly popular, with over 500,000 copies sold en route to $16 million in total lifetime sales, adding on to the already impressive sales figures for the Super Nintendo version of the title. Much like its predecessor, Donkey Kong Country 2 was undeniably a big deal. Rare, never content to rest on their laurels, would follow up Donkey Kong Country 2 with a sequel, which upon its release would also be well received by the majority of gamers and critics, while the Donkey Kong franchise itself would continue to have periodic releases over the years that followed, both developed by Rare, like Donkey Kong 64 for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, as well as Retro Studios, who would take over the franchise after Rare was purchased by Microsoft in 2002. Retro Studios would end up releasing Donkey Kong Country Returns for the Nintendo Wii in 2010, as well as Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze for the Wii U in 2014, both of which would, like their predecessors, be praised by critics and gamers alike. After Tropical Freeze, though, there really hasn't been a ton of news about future titles in either the broader Donkey Kong franchise or within the Donkey Kong Country series in general, short of re-releases like Tropical Freeze's Switch debut in 2018 and remakes like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which came out earlier this year and was itself a modern remake of the 2004 Game Boy Advance title of the same name. It's unclear what the future may hold for the Donkey Kong series, but I've gotta believe there's going to be something coming up in the future, simply because there's no way Nintendo will not continue to leverage such a popular and much beloved franchise. It'd be crazy to let Donkey Kong sit collecting dust, wouldn't it? Well, regardless of what the future holds, the fact is that Rare's Donkey Kong Country titles, and in particular Donkey Kong Country 2, set an incredibly high bar for any future platforming titles to meet. As the end result of an incredibly talented team's efforts, Donkey Kong Country 2 is one of those games that is always in the conversation whenever someone talks about the best games of all time, and in the minds of many gamers, it is simply one of those titles that needs to be experienced by anyone with even a passing interest in video games. It is, quite simply, a seminal work in video game history, and as such, is certainly a title that deserves to be respected and remembered forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Donkey Kong Country 2 today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. At its core, Donkey Kong Country 2 is the natural evolution of the platforming formula originally created for the original Donkey Kong Country, with multiple worlds to explore, levels to complete, secrets to find, and Kong family members to interact with. And if all Donkey Kong Country 2 was more of the same, you'd have a pretty darn good game on your hands. But in reality, Donkey Kong Country 2 is so much more than just a simple rehash of the original, and it is these new additions and refinements to the gameplay formula that make Donkey Kong Country 2 stand on its own as a unique gameplay experience. So let's talk about the game and how it both mimics, evolves, and downright leapfrogs the original Donkey Kong Country. Similar to the first title, DKC2 consists of a series of themed and interconnected worlds, in this case 8 different areas, though really only 7 are fully fleshed out, and within each of those worlds is a series of levels, 52 in total. Each individual world culminates with a boss fight, and within each world and in between certain levels, additional Kong family members will pop up on the map, each of which offers some key piece of functionality that will either provide some sort of utility to assist you in your quests, like saving your progress, flying to a previously visited world, getting hints for various stages in the game, or playing a bonus trivia game that, if you're successful, will award you with extra lives. The Kong family in Donkey Kong Country 2, however, does not do their work for free. Instead, they utilize a form of currency in the game, banana coins, for the majority of the services they provide. Typically speaking, the first time you use a given family member's service, it'll be free, with any subsequent times costing some small number of banana coins. Take saving your game, for instance. If you visit Wrinkly Kong at Kong College, you'll have the opportunity to save your progress, assuming you've unlocked the college in the given world you're exploring. The first time you try to save your game in that world, you'll be able to do that for free, and then any additional saves in that world will cost you 2 banana coins. I think this was an interesting way to evolve the first game's save system, which was free, but also occasionally required beating a bunch of levels before you unlock the save point for that world, which meant that losing all of your lives could result in significant loss of progress, especially given some of the difficulty of the first game's levels and the gauntlet of challenges that could be thrown at you. And yes, I am talking about you, Ice World. In Donkey Kong Country 2, save points are typically unlocked earlier in each world, which means less levels needing to be completed before you can actually save your progress, which is good. At the same time, saving your game after beating additional levels requires acquiring banana coins, which you may or may not be able to gather in certain levels, as they are often somewhat hidden or placed in difficult-to-reach locations. What this means is that even though you can technically access a world save point pretty early on, you still need to make your way through a level or two in order to actually use that save point, or at a minimum, reach a part of a stage where you can acquire a couple banana coins. Now, interestingly, banana coins are not part of your progress that is maintained when you save your game. Meaning, if you need to restore your game after you lose all of your lives, you'll be starting with 0 banana coins, regardless of how many you may have had when you saved your game. This was a minor frustration for me when I first discovered it, as I had banked quite a few coins over the first couple worlds, intentionally not spending them on the various Kong services that I could have purchased. After restoring my game and noticing I now had 0 coins, I'll admit being a little miffed at the whole thing. It didn't take me long to recover, but it was still one of those design decisions that, from my perspective, was a bit unfriendly to the player. Doubly unfriendly is the fact that you can't easily navigate between worlds once you enter a new area, preventing you from farming easier areas for banana coins or other resources like extra lives. You're stuck in your current world, unless you use Funky's flights to fly somewhere else. The issue there is that only your first flight is free, with subsequent flights costing 2 banana coins, which if you've just restored your game and restarted with 0 coins in the bank, can be a bit of a hassle. I mention this because, even though it was only a minor irritation, it did introduce a little bit of friction to the gameplay experience, and if you aren't a particularly skilled platform gamer, I could see this being potentially more irritating and frustrating. Even if you are an experienced platform gamer though, I expect you may hit some frustrations playing the game, because Donkey Kong Country 2 is quite the challenging experience, though it starts off innocuous enough through the first couple of worlds. When I first started playing the game, I recalled that many people had claimed that Donkey Kong Country 2 was one of the harder platformers on the Super Nintendo, and as I breezed through the first 2 worlds, I thought to myself, hey, I must be getting pretty good at playing these classic titles, because this is easy for me. Well, let me tell you, that was an entirely false sense of security and aptitude, as the game gets very challenging the farther you go into the game. That said, the difficulty curve here is pretty darn smooth, with only a few levels really being potential showstoppers due to the mechanics they employ or the general difficulty of the level's design. And speaking of level design, Donkey Kong Country 2 has perhaps the most diverse level design and gameplay mechanics ever featured in a platforming title from around this time, with only modern efforts like Super Mario Wonder even coming close to offering the same degree of diversity. The original Donkey Kong Country was pretty amazing in terms of offering different types of levels with unique mechanics, but Donkey Kong Country 2 far exceeds the diversity there, both in terms of the overall level types and gameplay mechanics, playable character dynamics, controllable animal friends, and enemy characters. As you play Donkey Kong Country 2, you'll likely notice that very few levels are ever alike. There is such a wide variety of gameplay types, and many levels mix different mechanics to create completely unique situations. Take, for example, wind physics, which is one of the several different environmental hazards modeled in the game. In one stage, you might be in a windy cavern, where every time you jump, the wind kicks up underneath you and propels you upward. In another stage, you might be facing horizontal wind gusts, where some chasms are impossible to cross unless you jump in time with the wind. Then, in another stage, you might be tasked with controlling Squawks the Parrot, one of the Kong's animal friends, to fly through a bramble-infested area while wind constantly whips back and forth, causing you to maneuver your flight path with significant obstacles, and deadly wind gusts preventing your forward progress. In each of these situations, the core mechanic, wind, is used in entirely different ways, and combined with other gameplay mechanics like your animal companions to create wholly new experiences in every single level of the game. Beyond the aforementioned windy levels, you also have traditional jungle stages, icy caves, pirate ships, roller coaster theme parks, including one level where you race your enemies, underwater reefs, lava caverns, mine shafts, swamps, beehives, castles, and more. Seriously, in a game with 52 levels, you'd expect a lot more repetition, but here, each theme is maybe repeated 2 to 3 times in the entire game. This translates into an experience that feels fresh every single time you enter a stage, which in every instance, far exceeds platformers released from around this time. Other than the different level themes, the number of unique mechanics embedded in each stage adds a level of gameplay diversity that well surpasses expectations. In one level, perhaps you'll be tasked with bouncing between a number of barrels as enemies move around them. In another, maybe you'll be able to control your barrels and actually move them around, but only until a countdown timer reaches 0, after which you get blasted off in whatever direction you may be facing at that point in time. Or perhaps another stage involves breaking a series of barrels to gain more time on a constantly dwindling clock, while avoiding other barrels that penalize you with time reductions. You might think that the number of possibilities here are finite, and yes, in reality, there are only so many combinations of mechanics someone could build into the game. While that may be true in reality, when you're playing the game, the possibilities feel endless. And we haven't even touched on your animal friends, some of whom, like Rambi the rhinoceros and Enguarde the swordfish, return from the original Donkey Kong Country, while others, like Rattly the rattlesnake and Squitter the spider, are entirely new for Donkey Kong Country 2. And here, the animal friends have been enhanced with special abilities that make level traversal both easier and more complex. As an example, Rattly the rattlesnake is primarily a jumping kind of character, with a springy leap that makes perfect sense given the coiled nature of his body. There will be occasions when you might reach an area of a level and think, there is no way I can reach that. In which case, you need to rely on Rattly's special move, which is a charged jump that allows you to reach previously unreachable heights. The most unique special animal move, though, has got to belong to Squitter the spider, who can build temporary platforms out of spider webs, allowing him to both cross uncrossable pits and climb unclimbable mountains, all through careful and continuous placement of spiderweb platforms. Interestingly, I played a good chunk of the game not even realizing that these animal friends had special moves, and yes, I admit it, I did not read the manual before beginning to play the game. I occasionally would reach different sections of certain stages where I would think to myself, well, there's gotta be a secret here, only to realize I had to execute my animal's special move in order to reveal it. I eventually figured it out as I went through for subsequent playthroughs of individual levels, the reason for which I'll touch upon shortly, but for now, suffice it to say that you should definitely leverage all of your animal friends' abilities whenever you get a chance. Oh, and speaking of secrets, Donkey Kong Country 2 has a ridiculous number of hidden areas, some of which contain additional useful items like banana coins or extra lives, while others hide special bonus stages, with each level in the game containing anywhere from 1 to 3 bonus levels. These bonus stages are the primary means of collecting a different type of collectible currency known as Creme Coins, which act as a gating mechanism to the game's somewhat hidden and ultra-difficult true final world, the Lost World. The way it works is, if you play the game normally, you'll likely reach the end of the game and defeat the big bad boss, only to discover that your completion percentage is nowhere near 100%. That can be caused for any number of reasons, such as missing certain collectible items, or potentially missing the Lost World entirely. In many of the worlds in the game, there's a location called Clubba's Kiosk, where if you access it, you'll see the character Clubba standing in front of a golden barrel, asking you for 15 Creme Coins as a sort of toll. If you pay the 15 Creme Coins, you'll be transported to the Lost World, which contains a set of super difficult stages, each of which requires a 15 Creme Coin payment in order to access them. All told, there are 5 special stages in the Lost World, which means there are 75 Creme Coins hidden throughout the 52 stages in the main game, some of which are really tricky to find. Because I missed a bunch of them my first time through the game, I ended up going back to play nearly every level over in order to find all of the Creme Coins needed to unlock each stage of the Lost World, and ultimately defeat the true boss of the game, unlocking the real final ending for the whole experience. All told, it took me probably over 20 hours to beat the game in full, including the number of times I died and had to reload from a save. Beyond the hidden Creme Coins, there is yet another collectible in the game, that being Donkey Kong or DK coins. There's one of these in each non-boss level of the game, and usually they're hidden in really out-of-the-way places that sometimes requires leaps of faith in order to reach. These coins are effectively for bragging rights, as they don't contribute to any particular unlockable or special mechanic in the game itself, other than increasing your overall completion percentage, which, assuming you beat every stage, collect every Creme Coin, and find every DK coin, can reach 102% if you find literally everything in the game. The DK coins, though, also provide a funny moment where your progress is compared against other Nintendo heroes like Mario, Yoshi, and Link. Assuming you find enough DK coins, you may make your way onto the pedestal, knocking one or multiple of these heroes down a peg. Once again, no real gameplay benefit here other than bragging rights, but it was amusing nonetheless. Regardless of how many collectibles you attempt to retrieve, you'll be using 2 main characters throughout your playthrough. Diddy Kong, who played a part in Donkey Kong Country 1, and Dixie Kong, who is new to Donkey Kong Country 2. Diddy Kong feels pretty much the same as he did back in the original Donkey Kong Country, with speedy moves, a cartwheel attack, and the ability to jump more agilely than his counterpart Dixie. Dixie, by contrast, feels a bit slower, can whip her hair around to attack nearby enemies, and also has the ability to float through the air by spinning her hair around, allowing you a degree of precision falling that is definitely useful in a number of levels, and downright required in others. For the most part, both characters control pretty similarly, though I will admit to some frustration when queuing up a run. For those who may not be aware, you can hold down the Y button on your Super Nintendo controller to run faster than you would normally move around a stage, which helps with covering ground quicker, as well as enables further reaching jumps. Well, the Y button is also the button you use for either your cartwheel attack if Diddy Kong, or your hair whip attack if Dixie Kong. And each of those moves has a degree of forward movement associated with them. So let's say you're standing on the edge of a cliff, and you think, I'm going to need to run and jump to cross that gap. You press down on your Y button thinking you're simply getting ready to execute a running maneuver, only to inadvertently send yourself off of the cliff to your doom because the game executed your forward moving attack. It only took a few times of making this mistake before I started jumping and pressing Y while in midair to prime my run, which feels like an unnecessary step, but did help reduce my overall frustration. Minor control hiccup aside, Donkey Kong Country 2 expands your actual teamwork abilities beyond the first title. In Donkey Kong Country, you were pretty much limited to switching back and forth between Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. There wasn't really much in the way of actual team-based moves to execute. Donkey Kong Country 2 adds a team-up move, where you effectively get on each other's shoulders, which allows you to throw your companion character either horizontally or vertically. This can prove useful in reaching otherwise unreachable ledges or accessing bonus barrels that otherwise can't be used, though I do want to issue a word of caution here. I don't know if it was me and my own inaccuracy or an issue with the game itself, but I would occasionally throw my companion Kong horizontally when I meant to throw him or her vertically, which in some instances was incredibly problematic because your companion Kong can actually die if you're thrown into an obstacle or enemy that would otherwise defeat you. Because of the occasional inaccuracy when using the team-up move, I ended up having to restart some levels, as there are certain stages that actually require both Kongs to be alive, and a team-up move in order to reach a bonus stage, which, like we talked about, is required in order to collect Krem coins and achieve the true ending to the game. To the best of my knowledge, there are no areas in the main game that require the team-up move in order to progress, which is good because it is a bit of a more advanced technique. If you're looking to truly explore everything the game has to offer though, or if you're looking for hidden passages with potential power-ups, you'll have to get used to this ability, which while useful, can be a bit finicky in my experience. The only other item I want to mention before we move on is the game's difficulty, which like we talked about earlier, is a mostly smooth curve for the majority of the game's main levels, though there are some levels that present some pretty significant difficulty spikes that will likely pose a challenge as you first make your way through the game. And during my first time through the game, I remember thinking that there were some areas that were totally ridiculous in terms of the mechanics and or design of a given stage, and I cursed my inability to progress further. Eventually, of course, I overcame those challenges, and I did eventually make my way to beat the main boss of the game, mostly having fun along the way. Like I mentioned earlier though, simply beating the main boss is not sufficient for getting the game's true ending, which meant I had to go through and replay nearly every level, sometimes multiple times, in order to find every secret bonus level and acquire the 75 Krem coins needed to unlock every level in the Lost World, which in turn unlocks the final boss of the game. As I prepared to tackle some really difficult levels for a second time, I initially felt a little bit of dread, because like I said, some of these stages were pretty darn frustrating. But here an interesting thing happened. As I began playing these stages over again, I began to have even more fun than my first time through the levels. I don't know if that's because I had some familiarity with the stages already, or if I had simply become more proficient at playing the game, but my second time through the game's levels was so much more fun than the first time that it reshaped how I thought about the game entirely. My first time through, I thought, well, this is a great game, albeit with some frustration. My second time through, I thought, this is an outstanding platforming experience, and I can see myself playing these levels for fun even if I didn't have to unlock every secret and complete every bonus level. From my perspective, Donkey Kong Country 2 is one of those rare games that get better the more you play it, and actually make you want to play it more even after you beat the game. I did not expect that at all during my first playthrough, but even sitting here thinking about the game around a week after beating it in full, I kind of feel like playing it again. It is simply that good. We'll talk more specifically about just how good Donkey Kong Country 2 is in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around this time where we didn't have pervasive access to all sorts of information on the internet. We had magazine reviews, we had word of mouth. Now for Donkey Kong Country 2, we probably had some additional information because Donkey Kong Country 1 was an unmitigated success. So when you see Donkey Kong Country 2 on the store shelf, you probably know what you're going to be getting yourself into. But still, I love looking at the back of the box because I just find it interesting. So, for Donkey Kong Country 2, for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the back of the box says, "Okay, kid, wipe that drool off your chin and listen up if you really want to learn something about this game. Sure, it's got newfangled computer graphics and what Diddy calls stereo sound that rocks heavily and with little resistance, but the gameplay? Well, they finally added some proper challenge to the game. A snap for me, of course. And the story? You sure ask a lot of questions, kid. Captain K. Rool and his cruelest cutthroat Kremlings have kidnapped that flea-bitten ape Donkey Kong. I figured I'd rescue him when the little pipsqueak Diddy pops up along with his girlfriend and they head off fixing to prove themselves heroes or something. Come to think of it, I haven't laid eyes on those two for quite a while. I just may have to help them out after all. Play as Diddy or Dixie Kong, each with unique abilities. 8 exciting worlds with all new levels and Kremlings. Brand new Kong family members and friends. Tons of new moves and special abilities. And more secrets and challenges than Donkey Kong Country. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, and I've got to say, yep, this box does it for me. The text itself was written in the style of Cranky Kong, and actually Cranky appears on the back of the box in a rocking chair, kind of looking all old and stuff, and you can kind of tell that he's talking to these young whippersnappers and trying to make sure you understand what you're going to get into when you buy the game. And guess what? Cranky, you sold me. I will get this game. Or at least that's what I would have said back in 1995 when it was originally released. So yes, this box definitely does it. And of course, the graphics look revolutionary. And back when it originally came out, there was literally nothing like it. We're now going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. And actually, let's start by talking about the graphics. Donkey Kong Country 2, like its predecessor, has the best graphics you're going to see on a 16-bit console. No ifs, ands, or buts. Surprisingly, Donkey Kong Country 2 actually surpasses the original Donkey Kong Country in terms of graphical fidelity and overall quality, mostly in the design of the game's environments and environmental effects. The most impressive new effect from my perspective has to be the windy cloud cover that you can see when you're playing levels that require ascending a ship's mast, which the first time I saw it as I entered the second stage of the game made my jaw drop even today. I was seriously impressed by pretty much every aspect of Donkey Kong Country 2's graphical design, and I truly mean it when I say the game is one of the best looking titles you will ever see on a 16-bit console. That quality extends beyond the game's environments and effects to include both player characters, enemies, and bosses, all of which are designed with a greater degree of variety than the original Donkey Kong Country. My sense walking away from Donkey Kong Country 2 is that this was Rare firing on all cylinders, having learned a lot from working on the first game, and it absolutely shows. That being said, if you personally are not a fan of Donkey Kong Country's two-dimensional sprites posing as fully rendered 3D object style, there's nothing here that's really going to change your mind. Donkey Kong Country 2 utilizes the same exact graphical style as the first game, albeit a refined version of that style. I personally love it, and not just because it was so revolutionary back when it was first created. To my eyes, it simply looks amazing even today, and I remain in awe of what Rare was able to accomplish. If you don't feel the same way as I do, though, you may find the graphics less appealing. From my perspective, though, Donkey Kong Country 2 is a great-looking game, and everything, from character and environmental artwork to special effects to animation, is pretty much perfect. No complaints at all. Moving on to the sound and music, Donkey Kong Country 2 has proven something that I originally began suspecting back when I played Donkey Kong Country 1, and that is that David Wise is one of the best 16-bit game music composers of all time. When I played the original Donkey Kong Country, I remember thinking that it was almost impossible to create a better sounding 16-bit soundtrack, and I still recall my own personal favorite track from that game, Aquatic Ambiance, which is legitimately a masterclass in getting the most from the Super Nintendo sound chip. When I started playing Donkey Kong Country 2, I was immediately taken aback as all of my favorites from the first game were nowhere to be found, and I wondered whether any tracks from this new experience could possibly equal or top the first game's soundtrack. Well, I can safely say my concerns were unfounded, as Donkey Kong Country 2's soundtrack, taken as a collective whole, is perhaps better than the first game soundtrack, with several standouts like Sticker Bush Symphony and In a Snowbound Land being personal favorites. When you listen to this music, you will immediately notice that David Wise is working on an entirely different level than any other composer who made a 16-bit soundtrack, and I'm even including legends like Koji Kondo in that assertion. The music in Donkey Kong Country 2 does not feel limited by 16-bit sound hardware, and its best tracks sound so advanced that I legitimately believe David Wise must be an audio wizard to get the Super Nintendo to sound this good. Fanboy moment aside, the rest of the game's audio environment sounds great as well, with well-designed sound effects that perfectly match the action on the screen. Bottom line, This is one of the best audio experiences available on a Super Nintendo system, and may even be one of, if not the best, cartridge-based soundtracks of all time. I'm actually listening to the soundtrack as I type up these notes, and I have to say, I have a huge smile across my face. Simply sublime work by David Wise. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Donkey Kong Country 2, you play as Diddy and Dixie Kong, a young Kong couple who set off in pursuit of kidnapped prior hero Donkey Kong. As DK was relaxing one evening after retrieving the Kong banana horde at the conclusion of Donkey Kong Country 1, spoiler alert, sorry, a group of Kremlings under the command of Captain K. Rool attack, kidnapping Donkey Kong and leaving a ransom note that effectively says, "Return the banana horde if you ever want to see Donkey Kong again." Cranky Kong, the patriarch of the Kong family, is ready to turn that banana horde over, but Diddy and Dixie both stand up and declare that instead of acquiescing to K. Rool's demands, they could go off on an adventure and save Donkey Kong. While the Kong family wasn't entirely convinced due to the duo's lack of experience, they eventually relent, and Diddy and Dixie set off to rescue their Kong buddy from the clutches of Captain K. Rool. The only question is, will their experience work against them? Or will they grow into the heroes they both know they can become? I've got to say, I loved the backstory for the game, and if anyone has a Donkey Kong Country 2 manual, I highly encourage you to read the 2-page introductory story that was included with the game, because unlike most platformers that present only a thinly veiled description of why you're being tasked with doing what you're doing, the Donkey Kong Country 2 story is both informative, engaging, and funny, with Cranky stealing the show with his boasts of how much of a better adventurer he was back in his time. I honestly did not expect to enjoy the backstory as much as I did, but just like everything else with Donkey Kong Country 2, it oozes quality. I have no critique. It is simply perfect within the context of the game. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've spoken a good deal about the framework for Donkey Kong Country 2 already, as well as some of my initial critiques, so I'm not going to repeat all of that here. What I do want to mention, though, is that generally speaking, the controls work incredibly well, and everything feels smooth and mostly in your control to manipulate, with most mistakes being attributable to your own failing rather than an issue with the game. That being said, there are a couple of control-related situations I faced, which I admit might not actually be the game's fault. For full transparency, I played through Donkey Kong Country 2 using an emulator, so it's possible my computer, my controller, or the emulator I used could have caused any of the issues I'm about to discuss. That said, it's also possible that the game may have had some inconsistencies that resulted in some control-related issues. I don't have a way to prove this, so if anyone has first-hand experience that either supports or refutes my observations, definitely let me know. For one, and we already discussed this, the team-up move can be a bit tricky to aim correctly, and there were several times where I thought I was aiming entirely vertically, only to accidentally send my Kong companion flying into a wall or off the side of a stage. I feel like this has to be related to the sensitivity of the D-pad on whatever controller you're using, with perhaps just a smidge too much sensitivity on the horizontal axis causing inconsistent throws. I didn't test this on an original Super Nintendo controller, so it's entirely possible this is a me issue and not a game issue. Another area I found some inconsistency around was grabbing onto climbable vines, which I would entirely miss on occasion, despite jumping directly into the vines as you're supposed to do. This is another one that feels like a controller sensitivity issue as opposed to an inherent game flaw, or perhaps I was simply not jumping high enough into the vines in some instances, but once again, I can't prove where the true issue lies. I also had some issues creating spiderweb platforms with Squidder the Spider, where occasionally the game would spawn a platform immediately after I fired my web, and at certain points previously placed spiderweb platforms would begin to disappear quicker than earlier placed platforms. The immediate deployment web platform thing could potentially have been a local issue as opposed to a game issue, but the web platform timing is something that I feel might need more investigation. It's unclear to me whether certain actions degraded web platforms more so than other actions, so it's possible this variable degradation is intentional by design. It certainly didn't feel that way, but I can see how it could be possible. And finally, and this is something that is inherent in the design of the game, I felt like the physics associated with vertical to horizontal movement, like what you'd experience when firing out of a vertical barrel and then needing to move left or right to land in another barrel, could be a bit inaccurate. This is simply a design decision that required some getting used to, as opposed to a design decision that made the game unplayable, but I still wanted to mention it. Otherwise, the controls for the game all feel great, and the experience of actually playing the game was the same as playing any other high-quality platform title. The only other item I'd like to mention is the various animal companions that you occasionally have the opportunity to control. Put simply, the animal sequences are some of the best moments in Donkey Kong Country 2, and I would legitimately play a game whose sole focus was the individual animal companion characters and different levels designed around those companions. Of all the animals in the game, my favorite is likely Angard the swordfish, because his swimming movement is so smooth that it feels like gliding along polished glass, and his offensive abilities are strong enough that you can pretty much defeat any enemies in your way without too much issue. My second favorite is definitely Squawks the parrot, who can fly around certain stages, and let me tell you, the feeling of flight in Donkey Kong Country 2 is pretty darn great. All of the other animal companions are fun to control too, and like we talked about earlier, the sheer number of gameplay mechanics in general make this game a diverse, engaging experience that remains enjoyable from beginning to end. Overall, Donkey Kong Country 2 felt amazing to play, with no significant critiques other than those observations already shared. The game kept getting better the more I played it, and even after fully completing the title, I still want to play more of it. If that's not the mark of an outstanding game, I don't know what is. So what is our verdict on Donkey Kong Country 2? Well, Donkey Kong Country 2 is a monumental achievement in mid-90s platformer design, and for its time was undoubtedly one of the best platforming titles ever created. Its unique combination of diverse mechanics, outstanding graphics, amazing music, and tight, for the most part, controls creates an experience that everyone needs to experience at some point in their gaming careers. When I originally sat down to play Donkey Kong Country 2, I assumed it would simply be more Donkey Kong Country, and I had relatively low expectations in terms of innovation and new game experiences. I was entirely wrong in my assumption. Donkey Kong Country 2 is a dramatically better game than the original Donkey Kong Country, and that's remarkable in its own right, as the original game itself was an outstanding title. Because Donkey Kong Country 2 does pretty much everything right, and remains an incredibly enjoyable title even today, it is no wonder that Donkey Kong Country 2 has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. It is a phenomenal game, and I honestly can't recommend it highly enough. If there's anyone out there who hasn't yet experienced the joy that is Donkey Kong Country 2, definitely drop what you're doing and fire it up, and you will get to experience a game that certainly deserves its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the point-and-click adventure, Flight of the Amazon Queen. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can and deliver the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to make sure that I am hitting the mark and continuing to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Flight of the Amazon Queen. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.